A mother's hope and an unexpected feeling. Evelyn Reed sat in her favorite chair by the window, watching the late afternoon sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of pink and amber, casting long shadows across her neatly trimmed lawn. She sighed softly, running her fingers along the edge of the delicate porcelain teacup in her hands. Tomorrow was the day she had been waiting for. A day filled with excitement, pride, and if she were honest with herself, a twinge of apprehension. Her only son, Julian, was bringing home his fiancée, Naomi. It would be the first time she met the woman he had chosen to spend his life with. And while Evelyn had every reason to be happy, an unease she couldn't quite place settled in her heart. Julian had always been her pride and joy. From the moment she had brought him home as a 7-year-old boy, frightened and wary of the world, she had loved him as fiercely as any mother could. Adopting him had been the best decision of her life, filling the aching void left by years of silent grief. She had raised him with unwavering devotion, guiding him through every challenge, celebrating every triumph. And now he was a man, successful, intelligent, and deeply in love. She should have been overjoyed, but something gnawed at her, an inexplicable feeling that wouldn't let her rest. Evelyn stood up and walked to the mantel, where framed photographs of Julian lined the wooden surface. His graduation day, his first day as a doctor, a candid shot of him laughing with her in the garden. He had always been her greatest blessing. She turned to the dining table, meticulously set for dinner. White plates with gold trim, linen napkins folded neatly, and a floral centerpiece she had arranged that morning. It was a simple but elegant setup, one that spoke of warmth and welcome. Yet, despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the nerves bubbling under the surface. Evelyn had spoken to Naomi only a few times over the phone, and though the young woman had been polite and warm, something about their conversations had left Evelyn feeling unsettled. It wasn't anything Naomi had said, no red flags, no reason to suspect anything was wrong. But a mother's intuition was rarely wrong, and Evelyn had learned long ago to trust hers. As the clock struck 6, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her straighten her posture. She took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of her dress. The time had come. She stepped onto the porch just as Julian climbed out of the sleek black sit-in. He looked as handsome as ever in his tailored navy blue suit, his confident stride carrying him toward her with the ease of a man who had everything in the world to be happy about. "Mom," he said with a broad smile, pulling her into a warm embrace. "My sweet boy," she murmured against his shoulder, squeezing him just a little tighter than usual. When they pulled apart, Julian turned and reached for the passenger door. "Mom, I'd like you to meet Naomi." The door opened, and out stepped a strikingly beautiful woman. She was poised, her warm brown skin glowing in the soft evening light. Her dark, coiled hair was styled into a sophisticated updo, and she carried herself with effortless grace. Her eyes, deep, expressive, and filled with intelligence, met Evelyn's, and she smiled warmly. "It's such a pleasure to finally meet you, Mrs. Reed," Naomi said, extending her hand. Evelyn took it, noting the firmness of her grip, the confidence in her gaze. "Please, call me Evelyn." Julian beamed, clearly pleased by the exchange. "Mom, I told you so much about Naomi. She's an incredible doctor, one of the best in her field." Evelyn nodded, ushering them inside. Come in. Dinner is ready." They sat down at the table, the conversation flowing with ease. Naomi spoke eloquently about her work, her passion for cardiology, and her upbringing. She was warm, engaging, and clearly adored Julian. And yet, Evelyn couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Then, as Naomi reached for her glass, the sleeve of her dress shifted slightly, revealing a delicate, almost faded scar on the inside of her elbow. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her fork. The room around her seemed to fade as her gaze locked onto the mark. A mark she had seen before. a mark she had once traced with her fingers in the quiet moments of bedtime stories and whispered lullabies. A mark that belonged to the daughter she had lost so many years ago. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Yet, deep down, Evelyn knew. Naomi wasn't just her son's fiancée. She was the child Evelyn had spent a lifetime searching for. A mother's heart remembers. The room around Evelyn blurred, the clinking of silverware and soft murmur of conversation fading into the background as her world narrowed to a single point of focus. That scar. Her mind reeled, struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The shape, the placement. It was exactly the same as the one she had traced on her daughter's arm when she was just a little girl. A scar from a childhood accident, a tiny moment in time that had felt insignificant back then, but now seemed like a beacon from the past that had stolen her daughter away. She tried to keep her hand steady as she reached for her napkin, dabbing at the corners of her mouth more to ground herself than out of necessity. Her heart pounded so loudly, she thought Julian and Naomi might hear it. But they didn't. Julian was laughing at something Naomi had said, his eyes filled with adoration. Naomi was smiling, unaware that her future mother-in-law was staring at her as if she had seen a ghost. Evelyn took a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around the napkin. This was impossible. It had to be. And yet, memories flooded her mind like a dam breaking. A small, curly-haired girl giggling as she played in the garden. A warm little hand grasping hers as they crossed the street. The echo of laughter in their modest home. A child's voice calling out, "Mama, look at me." And then, a beach, a moment of distraction. An empty space where her daughter had been. A lifetime of searching. A lifetime of unanswered questions. Now, sitting across from her, was a woman with the same scar, the same eyes, the same presence. Could it really be her? Evelyn felt lightheaded, overwhelmed by the weight of emotions pressing down on her. She needed a moment, just one moment to think. She cleared her throat, forcing a polite smile. "Excuse me for a moment. I'll be right back." Pushing back her chair, she stood up, trying to make her movements appear natural. She walked toward the kitchen, gripping the counter for support the moment she was out of sight. She needed air. She needed clarity. She took a few deep breaths, pressing a hand to her chest. If this was true, if Naomi was really the daughter she had lost all those years ago, what was she supposed to do? Would Naomi even believe her? Would Julian? A part of her wanted to burst back into the dining room, to grab Naomi's hands and demand to know everything. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not without proof. She couldn't shatter her son's happiness based on a feeling. Not without knowing for sure. Just as she was trying to steady herself, she heard quiet footsteps behind her. "Mrs. Reed." Evelyn turned, her breath catching as she saw Naomi standing in the doorway. Her eyes were filled with quiet concern, her brow slightly furrowed. "Are you all right?" For a moment, Evelyn couldn't speak. She could only look at the young woman in front of her, the young woman who, if fate was truly as cruel as it was miraculous, might very well be the little girl she had spent a lifetime mourning. She swallowed hard, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine, dear. Just needed a moment." Naomi stepped closer, a gentle warmth in her expression. "Are you sure? I know meeting me for the first time must be a big deal for you. Julian talks about you all the time. He loved you so much." Evelyn felt something inside her crack. Her son, her daughter, in the same room, unknowingly connected by a truth that had yet to be spoken. She wanted to tell Naomi everything right then and there, but she stopped herself. She needed more than instinct. She needed to know for certain. So instead, she took a deep breath and nodded. "I appreciate that, dear. Really. I do." Naomi hesitated for a moment, as if sensing that there was something unsaid between them. But then she smiled again, reaching for Evelyn's hand and giving it a gentle squeeze. It was such a small gesture, but to Evelyn, it felt like the past reaching through time. her daughter, her little girl. And yet, Naomi had no idea. Evelyn swallowed down the lump in her throat. There was one thing she knew for certain. She had to find out the truth. And she had to do it before the wedding. The truth begins to unfold. Evelyn barely slept that night. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every detail of her dinner with Julian and Naomi. The scar on Naomi's arm had shaken her to her core, but there was something else, something deeper, a feeling, an unshakable instinct that told her this was no coincidence. She turned on her side, gripping the edge of her blanket as old emotions swirled inside her. For decades, she had searched for her daughter, clung to hope until the years made it unbearable. But if Naomi truly was Amara, what then? Would she even remember? Did she know the truth about her past? And if she didn't, how could Evelyn tell her? The questions kept her awake. And by morning, she knew there was only one thing she could do. She had to investigate. The next day, after Julian had left for work and Naomi had returned to her apartment, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table with an old wooden box in front of her. The same box she had opened the night before. Inside were the remnants of her past. Photographs, keepsakes, and a few faded documents from the investigation into Amara's disappearance. She ran her fingers over the old newspaper clippings, her breath catching at the sight of the headlines. Local child missing from family beach trip. Search continues. Mother desperately seeks answers in missing daughter case. Her hands trembled as she reached for an old photograph of Amara. She had been just 5 years old when she vanished. A little girl with deep brown skin, bright eyes, and a giggle that could light up a room. The resemblance to Naomi was undeniable. Evelyn swallowed hard, flipping the photo over. There, written in her own handwriting, was something she had forgotten she'd done all those years ago. Amara, age 5. Scar on right elbow from playground fall. The breath rushed from her lungs. This was it. This was the sign she had been waiting for. But she needed more. Her heart pounded as she reached for her phone and scrolled to Julian's contact. She hesitated for a moment before typing a message. Julian, I'd love to see Naomi again. Would you two be free for dinner this weekend? She waited, the seconds stretching painfully. Then his reply came. Of course, Mom. She'd love that. Saturday sound good. Evelyn exhaled. Saturday. That gave her just enough time to find out the truth. A shocking revelation. Evelyn spent the next 2 days searching for anything she could about Naomi's past. She needed to know where she had grown up, who had raised her, and most importantly, if she had ever been adopted. She started with the obvious. Public records. Sitting at the local library, she scrolled through old birth records and newspaper archives, piecing together what little information she could find. Naomi had been raised in Alabama, which sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. Alabama, the very state where Amara had disappeared. She had been adopted at the age of 6 by a couple named Bernard and Angela Bennett. There were no details on where she had been before that, only that she had been placed in a children's home before her adoption. A children's home. A place where lost children ended up. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists. This couldn't be a coincidence. Naomi had been found, but no one had ever connected her to the child who had been reported missing. Her heart ached at the thought of it. Had Amara, Naomi, been waiting for her all these years, never knowing that her real mother had never stopped searching? Evelyn took a deep breath. She needed to speak to Naomi directly, and she needed to do it before the wedding. The dinner that changed everything. By the time Saturday arrived, Evelyn had barely eaten or slept. She had prepared dinner as usual, but her mind was elsewhere. The air in the house felt heavier, charged with unspoken words, and the weight of the past pressing down on her. At exactly 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. Evelyn smoothed her dress and opened the door, forcing a smile as Julian and Naomi stepped inside. Mom. Julian greeted her with a warm hug. Smells amazing in here. Naomi smiled. It really does. Thank you for having us again." Evelyn nodded, stepping aside to let them in. As Naomi walked past, Evelyn's eyes drifted again to her arm, to the scar. A scar that had haunted her for decades. Evelyn's heart pounded as she led them to the table. They exchanged polite conversation at first, Julian happily chatting about work, Naomi laughing about a clumsy patient she had treated that week. But Evelyn wasn't really listening. She was waiting. Finally, as the plates were cleared, Evelyn placed her hands in her lap and took a deep breath. "Naomi," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but do you remember anything from your early childhood, before your adoption?" Naomi blinked in surprise. Julian frowned. "Mom, why do you ask?" Evelyn hesitated before answering. "I've been thinking a lot about family lately, and I realized I never asked Naomi much about hers." Naomi tilted her head, as if considering the question. "Honestly, I don't remember much before I was adopted. Just bits and pieces. I was in a children's home for a while, but I don't know how I got there. I always assumed I was abandoned." Evelyn's throat tightened. "You weren't," she whispered. Naomi's eyes widened slightly. "What?" Evelyn inhaled shakily. "You weren't abandoned, Naomi." Julian's expression darkened with confusion. "Mom, what are you saying?" Evelyn reached for the old wooden box she had placed beside her chair. Slowly, she opened it and pulled out the faded photograph of Amara. She turned it over, revealing the handwritten note about the scar. Then, she placed it in front of Naomi. "Naomi, I think you are my daughter." The room fell into stunned silence. Naomi's face paled as she stared at the photo, then at Evelyn, then at Julian. This can't be real," she breathed. Julian looked between them, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, are you sure?" Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening. "I lost my daughter on a beach in Alabama when she was 5 years old. She had a scar on her arm from falling at the playground. You have that same scar, Naomi." Naomi stared down at her arm as if seeing it for the first time. Her voice faltered, emotion rising in her throat. Evelyn reached out, tears welling in her eyes. "I have spent my whole life searching for you." Naomi's breath hitched, her hands trembling. And then the tears came. Soft at first, then falling freely down her cheeks as she choked out, "Mom." Evelyn let out a quiet sob, wrapping Naomi in her arms. And for the first time in 30 years, she held her daughter again, a family reunited. For the first time in decades, Evelyn held her daughter in her arms. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she clung to Naomi, unable to fully comprehend the miracle that was unfolding in front of her. The daughter she had mourned, searched for, prayed for, was here, alive. Naomi trembled in her embrace, gripping Evelyn like she was afraid to let go. It was as if something deep inside her had shifted, a missing piece of her life snapping into place. Julian sat frozen, his breath unsteady, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. His mother had just told them the unthinkable, that his fiancée was his long-lost sister. It was impossible. And yet, looking at them, at Naomi in his mother's arms, sobbing like a child reunited with a piece of her soul, he knew it was true. The resemblance, the scar, the missing childhood memories. It all made sense now. Evelyn pulled back, cupping Naomi's face with shaking hands. "I never gave up on you," she whispered. "Not for a second." Naomi let out a shaky breath, wiping at her tear-streaked cheeks. I don't even know what to say. I never knew I had a mother looking for me all this time." Evelyn shook her head. "None of this is your fault, sweetheart. You were taken from me, but you're here now. And that's all that matters." Naomi swallowed hard, overwhelmed with emotion. Her whole life, she had felt a quiet emptiness, a strange sense that something was missing, but she had never understood why. Now, the answers were right in front of her. But as the weight of the revelation sank in, Another reality crashed into her like a wave. She turned to Julian. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. "Julian," she whispered, "what does this mean for us?" Her voice was laced with fear, because she already knew the answer. A love that was never meant to be. Julian felt like the ground beneath him had disappeared. He had loved Naomi for years. He had built a life with her, dreamed of a future with her. They were supposed to get married. And yet, everything they had was built on a truth they never knew. She was his sister, his flesh and blood. The weight of it crushed him. His voice cracked, and he exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. This can't be real. Naomi's chest ached as she watched him struggle to process what had just happened. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Julian, I love you." Evelyn's heart shattered at the pain in her children's eyes. She had found her daughter, but in doing so, she had also torn apart something precious between them. Julian let out a slow breath. "I love you too, Naomi," he murmured, his voice raw. But not like this. A silence stretched between them, one filled with sorrow, with a painful understanding that the life they had planned together was never meant to be. Naomi nodded, looking away as fresh tears welled in her eyes. We can't get married." It was the hardest sentence she had ever spoken. And yet, deep down, she knew it was the truth. Julian reached for her hand, his grip warm and familiar. "But we're not losing each other," he said firmly. "You're my sister, Naomi. That doesn't change. It just means our future looks different than we thought." His words, though filled with heartbreak, were also filled with love. And Naomi clung to that love with everything she had. Finding a new beginning. The wedding was called off. There was no easy way to explain it to the guests, no way to make sense of it to the outside world. But within their small family, they knew the truth. Julian and Naomi spent days unraveling their emotions, mourning the loss of the relationship they had shared, while embracing the bond they had unknowingly always had. It wasn't easy. Letting go of what they had been to each other was painful, but the love between them remained. It simply changed shape. Evelyn, too, had to navigate a new reality, one where she had both of her children back, but had also been the catalyst for their heartbreak. She watched over them with quiet care, giving them space to heal, but never letting them feel alone. And slowly, with time, the pain gave way to something new. Hope. A chance to build something real. A family. 1 year later, Naomi stood on the beach, staring out at the waves crashing against the shore. She had spent months unraveling her past, meeting the people who had raised her, filling in the missing gaps of her life. It had been an emotional journey, one filled with grief, discovery, and ultimately, peace. Julian stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, his face calm. "You okay?" he asked softly. Naomi turned to him and smiled. A real, genuine smile. "I am." She had let go of the sorrow, of the aching loss of what could have been. Because what she had now, it was enough. More than enough. She reached for Julian's hand, squeezing it gently. "You?" Julian exhaled and nodded. "Yeah, I think I am too." For the first time, in a long time, things felt right. Not perfect, not easy, but right. And as they stood together, watching the sunset, they both knew. This was the beginning of something beautiful. A second chance, a family found, and a future that, despite everything, still held endless possibilities. This story gives a realistic, heartfelt, and uplifting ending to the story. It embraces the emotional weight of the revelation while offering hope, healing, and the strength of family bonds. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.